We all know the Roman Empire is one of the most influential civilizations in world history. It's been studied for centuries, praised for its achievements, and criticized for its vices. However, there is one aspect of the Roman Empire that isn't discussed very often. In fact, it's surprising how little this topic has come up over the years. In this episode, we will be exploring what some historians call the Teutonic trap, where a group of so-called barbarians were able to beat Rome at its own game. Let's get into it. By the 2nd century BC, the Romans had conquered much of the Mediterranean. As they grew in power, they expanded their military draft, which forced many Italian men to leave their homes, to take up arms and fight for Rome. One can only imagine the despair that befell the families of these men who were ripped from their loved ones. The emotional toll of losing your husband, father, or son to the battlefield is immeasurable. But this was the price the Italians paid to maintain Rome's dominance. However, even with all the manpower Rome could muster, it couldn't keep conquering new lands forever. So the Romans turned to diplomacy. They negotiated peace treaties with nearby tribes, which sometimes involved giving them Roman citizenship and granting them certain privileges. But other times, it involved paying them directly to stay out of Rome's hair. This was the case with the Teutonics. The Teutonics were an ancient Germanic people who lived north of the Danube River in modern-day Germany. They were fierce warriors known throughout Europe for their courage and strength. It's believed that the Teutonics were made up of several tribes who came together under one banner to resist the Roman advance. They preferred living in freedom rather than becoming slaves to Rome's tyranny. So the Romans offered them a deal. Stop being a thorn in our side, and we'll pay you not to attack us. In return, the Teutonics received payment in the form of gold and silver, which they could use to improve their way of life. With these riches, they could buy better weapons, build stronger homes, and even hire mercenaries to protect their borders. For a while, this seemed like a good deal for both sides. The Romans didn't have to worry about the Teutonics attacking them, and the Teutonics got to enjoy the benefits of Roman wealth. But as time went on, the Teutonics became restless. The Roman money was nice, but it didn't last forever. And the Teutonics were a proud people who didn't want to live off handouts. So they started to look for ways to make their own money. They began to raid the Roman provinces, stealing their goods and taking their women and children back to their homeland as slaves. Of course, Rome wasn't happy about this, but they couldn't do much to stop it. After all, they were paying the Teutons to stay out of their territory. They tried to convince them to stop raiding by increasing the amount of money they received, but it didn't work. The Teutonics wanted more than just Roman gold. They wanted freedom. In the meantime, the Gauls also became restless. They were another group of people who lived outside of the Roman Empire and were paid not to attack Rome, but they too wanted more. And in 390 BC, they did something that shocked the Romans. They attacked and sacked Rome itself. It was a humiliating defeat for the Romans, but it also made the Gauls rich. They stole tons of gold, silver, and jewels from the city and took it back to their homeland. With the Gaulish attack on Rome, it became clear that Rome needed to do something about these so-called barbarians. They couldn't keep paying them to stay away because it wasn't working. They needed to find another solution, so the Romans did what they did best. They went to war. They fought against the Gauls first because they were a bigger threat. The Gauls were defeated and forced to pay Rome a heavy war indemnity. For the Teutonics, they were able to escape Roman wrath for a few more years. But in 358 BC, Rome caught up with them and demanded that they pay tribute. The Teutonics refused and prepared for battle. The Roman army was huge, made up of soldiers from all over their vast empire. They had everything from infantry to cavalry, and their discipline was unmatched. The Teutonics were outnumbered and outgunned, but they didn't care. They were fighting for their freedom, and they were willing to die for it. The battle was long and bloody, but in the end, the Teutonics won. They killed or captured almost every Roman soldier and sent a message to the rest of the barbarian tribes. Rome wasn't invincible. It was a humiliating defeat for the Romans, and it made the Teutonics famous throughout Europe. The tribes looked to them as heroes who had beaten the mighty Roman Empire. The Teutonic victory inspired other tribes to rebel against Rome. In the years that followed, Rome found itself in a never-ending war with various Germanic peoples. The Romans couldn't win because the barbarians had something that the Romans didn't: unity. The Teutonics may have been the first to realize this, but they weren't the last. Throughout history, there have been countless examples of underdogs uniting to take down a seemingly invincible opponent. It doesn't matter if you're talking about David and Goliath, the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, or the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan. The same story repeats itself over and over again because human nature doesn't change. The Romans had grown so powerful that they had made themselves vulnerable. They were surrounded by enemies who were tired of their tyranny and ready to fight back. Rome was eventually defeated because it's impossible to conquer everyone and keep them down forever. Someone will always rise up and take the fight to the oppressor. After the battle with the Teutonics, Rome would go on to fight many more battles against various Germanic tribes. They would win some and lose others, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. The Teutonics had proven that Rome could be beaten, and that's all it took. Other tribes would follow their lead and cause nothing but trouble for the Romans. Rome would eventually fall, not because of one specific event, but because of a series of events that chipped away at its power until it was no longer able to defend itself. The barbarians were a big part of that, and without them, Rome may have lasted longer. The Roman Empire is often seen as an unstoppable force, a civilization that was destined to rule the world. But that's not entirely true, okay? Rome was a product of its time, and like all civilizations, it had its strengths and weaknesses. Its greatest weakness was also its greatest strength: its size. Rome was huge, and that made it difficult to defend. The further away a province was from Rome, the harder it was to defend, and those provinces were often the ones that were attacked first. The Teutonics knew this, and they chose to attack Rome's far-flung territories instead of attacking Rome directly. That was a smart move because it allowed them to avoid the bulk of Rome's military might and focus on winning battles against less disciplined troops. Rome's size also made it difficult to communicate. Messages would take days to travel the length of the empire, and that meant that Rome was often slow to react to attacks. By the time the message reached the relevant people, it was often too late to do anything about it. The Teutonics knew this, and they used it to their advantage. They launched surprise attacks and then disappeared into the forest before Rome could mount a defense. Another advantage the Teutonics had was their knowledge of the land. They knew the forests like the back of their hand, and they used that knowledge to their advantage. They ambushed the Romans, cut off their supplies, and made it difficult for them to navigate the unfamiliar terrain. The Romans were out of their element, and that made it easier for the Teutonics to defeat them. Another advantage the Teutonics had was their willingness to fight. The Romans were professional soldiers who were used to fighting in neat, orderly battles, but the Teutonics were different. They were fierce and unrelenting, and they were willing to fight to the death. That made them dangerous opponents because the Romans couldn't defeat them through sheer force of arms. Finally, the Teutonics were united, and that gave them a major advantage over Rome. Rome was a collection of different peoples who often fought among themselves. That made it hard for Rome to put up a unified defense against the Teutonics. The Teutonics were able to exploit these divisions and play the Romans against each other, which made it even easier for them to defeat Rome. The Teutonic victory over Rome was a major turning point in European history. It marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Germanic people's dominance in Europe. It was also a major event in the development of warfare in Europe. The Teutonics showed that it was possible to defeat the Roman Empire, and that inspired other tribes to do the same. The Teutonic victory was also a major event in the development of European culture. The Teutonics were a Germanic tribe, and their victory over Rome helped to spread Germanic culture throughout Europe. This would have a major impact on the development of European culture and identity. In conclusion, the Teutonic victory over Rome was a major event in world history. It marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Germanic people's dominance in Europe. It also had a major impact on the development of warfare and culture in Europe. Connies were a fierce and determined people, and their victory over Rome is a testament to their courage and determination. They were able to defeat the Roman Empire by exploiting its weaknesses and using their knowledge of the land and their willingness to fight to the death. Their victory was a major turning point in European history and is still celebrated today.